Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with some tips on critical listening. And today I want to talk about a very, very tricky topic, one that's actually easy to hear, but somewhat difficult to articulate, especially without long and extensive musical examples. But I want to throw it out there anyway, and then turn you loose to do your own discovery. The topic is movement. How does a composer make his music move, or give it the perception that it's moving forward purposefully? This is a really, really important quality, because without it, the music obviously doesn't move. In other words, it seems to be sitting in one place, treading water, not making any real progress. And that's a big, big issue. It's a problem that lots of composers have to a greater or lesser degree, particularly contemporary composers, because now that we've returned to tonality, the atonal interruption has been more or less suppressed. Composers are writing music that we would generally regard as kind of listenable, but whether it's satisfying or not has nothing to do with whether it's harmonically easy or acceptable or digestible. That makes, of course, the time that you spend listening to it more pleasurable than it might have otherwise been. But that doesn't mean you're going to have a satisfying listening experience if the thing doesn't go anywhere. And what made it go somewhere was not just the fact that it was less dissonant or harmonically consonant or digestible or easy or whatever you want to call it. It was the rules of classical tonality that made it go. And the fact is, today we are just as far from classical tonality as well, no matter how the music's written, whether it's tonal or atonal or whatever, those rules are gone. That practice is gone. And with the practice went a real genuine musical quality, that function of movement. And the best way, I think, to illustrate this concept of movement is to suggest that you listen to some things, because some composers have it and some composers don't. In the classical period, they had it by way of the rules of harmony. That is, the sonata style, where a piece of music begins in a key and then goes through a certain number of other ones on the way to working its way back home, back where we started. That process involves the perception that the music is going someplace. It starts at a point, it goes to other points, and returns to that point at the end. And it's a very satisfying thing. It's just enormously satisfying. Wonderfully so. And Haydn and Mozart really had that quality. And many of their companions did too, to a greater or lesser degree. But any composition that's written in that sonata style that's competent is going to achieve that. That is the nature of the aesthetic that they were working in. Beethoven is a very interesting case. And to that extent, I would really urge you to listen to his Fourth Symphony. I've talked about this pretty extensively in discussing that symphony, but I just want to say this is the work where Beethoven himself really mastered the idea of movement, the ability to go fast or slow and everything in between without ever bogging down or having dead spots. The Eroica, for example, the third, for all its revolutionary qualities and gloriousness and importance and significance and historical, all that stuff, has real issues of movement, which can be disguised in a great performance. They're not beyond the ability of the performers to deal with by flexibility of tempo and a little bit of smart accentuation and phrasing. You can deal with those things because the basic style is one of movement. But that does not mean that the composer has mastered his proportions. But in the Fourth Symphony, he does. If you compare the finales of the Third and the Fourth Symphonies, for example, or the slow movements, the Funeral March of the Eroica is one of the glories of Western music. It truly is. but it has some dead spots, particularly the coda, when you're not quite sure where it's going to stop or when, whereas the slow movement of Beethoven's Fourth Symphony is a very similar movement, actually. They're both rondos in terms of structure. That is A, B, A, C, A, D, A. They have a theme that keeps returning and contrasting sections. But in the Fourth Symphony, the piece moves with so much more freedom. And it just sounds like it has a fluidity and a purposefulness that the Funeral March of the Eroica doesn't have to the same degree. You may disagree with me, but I think that that's probably reasonable, a reasonable assumption I'm making or assertion on my part. And you can listen for yourself. But in the Fourth Symphony, you have that wonderful slow introduction to the first movement, that limber, fabulous allegro, the gorgeous second movement, the minuet that comes around, or it's a scherzo, pardon me, that comes around twice, and has this it just goes, and the finale goes like the wind. There's never a moment where you sense that the music is sitting back on its heels, scratching his head, wondering what it's supposed to do next. And from then on, Beethoven was in great shape. I mean, he aced it from the Fourth Symphony onwards. But it's kind of interesting to learn how composers manage certain qualities, because not every composer does everything equally well all at once. And some qualities they need to acquire. Beethoven also had issues with his contrapuntal writing, as we all know. I mean, the Grosse Fuga being the classic case of a true Beethovenian exercise in counterpoint that took him a huge amount of time and effort to achieve. And so that's another aspect of composition, but we're talking about movement. So that was Beethoven. In the Romantic period, this idea of movement was a real problem. It was a real problem for Romantic composers because they tended to write in long, lyrical melodies which were self-contained. In other words, the reason we love them is because they wrote gorgeous tunes, but those tunes have a beginning, a middle, and an end in and of themselves. And what are you going to do with them? How do you do anything with them? If you put them in a larger form, you have to somehow justify that larger form and give people a sense that that form has a certain inevitability and shape and determination of direction. But when you hear the beautiful tune, and the beautiful tune comes to an end, and it stops, and then the composer has to do something else, and all you want to do is hear the beautiful tune again, and so maybe they'll repeat it. Maybe they'll repeat it a lot. Maybe they won't. And you'll just say, oh, goodness, I wish the beautiful tune would come back. Composers like Tchaikovsky had that issue. They resolved the issue. They often did. Schumann had that issue big time. A lot of composers had that problem. Brahms solved that problem. He did not have that problem in his symphonic writing, but the way he solved that problem is by not repeating tunes endlessly, by constantly developing them, and the music giving some indication that it wanted to be someplace other than where the tune always was. And so, we hear these things. Again, these are very, very general principles I'm talking about. But after the Romantic period, as music began to crumble under the onslaught of chromaticism, which would become atonality eventually, the movement problem only got worse. It really did. There were always composers with their own strange sense of movement, like Bruckner. Bruckner is a wonderful example because everything he wrote is slow. Even his fast movements are slow. I mean, the surface may seem to be going more quickly, but the underlying movement is always slow. But it was a movement. In other words, it had its own pace, a magisterial pace, granted, but it was a legitimate type of movement personal to that composer. But Wagner, for example, Wagner, who was like the big example of that, started to undermine this classical sense of movement. His sense of movement is also always very slow. Even when the music is zipping along, like in The Ride of the Valkyries, don't you get the feeling that it's really basically pretty slow? Dun dun ba ba dun da 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 ba ba da ba ba bum ba da ba, and underneath it's going bum ba bum ba bum bum ba bum bum ba. It's supposed to be light and it's supposed to be lively, and it is lively, but is it moving that quickly? I mean, are those babes on horseback with, the winged helmets and brass bras, as Anna Russell would say? Are they really flying along that zippily? I think not. And when you get to pieces like Tristan and Isolde, which is shot with this, what they call iridescent chromaticism. That is, it's beautiful, beautiful music. But what makes it so hypnotic, especially parts like the Liebesnacht in the second act, the love scene, or the final love death with Isolde, it's the fact that it's trance-inducing. It's the whole point of it is that you feel this enormous surge of passion and intensity, but it isn't going anywhere. It's not going anywhere at all. It's just sitting there. And eventually, it just expires. That's how Wagner creates so much tension. There's this enormous amount of pressure between this desire to seemingly move on and the music's unwillingness to move. I mean, that was an absolutely conscious aesthetic decision on his part. And, some people like it and it drives some people crazy. It takes some people a long time. It's a very different concept of movement than what we have in the classical period. Now, atonality, one of the biggest issues people have with atonal or 12-tone music is that you don't know where you are in it. You have no idea what's going to happen. You have no idea why it's happening. And it doesn't seem to be moving forward at any recognizable pace. You don't feel any push to a resolution. And as a result of that, it makes people nuts. It makes it sound as though you're going to be stuck in it forever listening to this screechy, dissonant music. And that makes it even more irritating than it might otherwise be. Some composers, again, they found their own answers. They found their solutions in certain works. Something like, Berg's 3 pieces for orchestra, or Webern, who wrote very brief pieces. They're very short. One of the reasons they're so short, one of the reasons he wants every note to mean something and matter is because they wouldn't sound better if they were any longer. The music doesn't go anywhere. It simply expresses a state. A static state. It might be horror. It might be, less horror, some varying degrees of horror, but it does its thing and then it just stops. And that's what's true of a lot of music written in that style. And the longer and bigger it got, the more, frankly, annoying it often sounds because the music simply sits there and keeps us permanently in suspense. Now, there are so many other qualities of music besides the quality of movement. There is rhythm, there is timbre, there is counterpoint, there is texture, there are dynamics, there are a lot of things that you can do aside from movement that will keep us continuously engaged. And if composers are wonderful at those other elements, you may not notice that there's a movement problem, or you may not care, even if you do. It's all about the mix and the recipe, right? Whether it's a successful blending or not. But once the atonal period left, as I said, here we are now listening to music which is largely tonal, but it has no more propensity to get on with it, frankly, than atonal music does. And for me, anyway, I would rather listen to atonal stuff as often as not, because at least I find it, ear tickling. I want to know what's going to happen next. And there's the tonal stuff. You can often predict what's going to happen, and you don't care. So, that's a real issue. There were composers who found their path forward in other ways. 2 of them found a similar were Mahler and Nielsen. Nielsen, particularly, who was one of the greatest masters of movement since Beethoven. His works have tremendous forward momentum and energy, and he's constantly pushing them forward, not to return to where they started, but to achieve a goal that's somewhere else other than where they started. But the process is very similar and has just as much of that Beethoven-like energy and force and feeling of struggle and transcendence and overcoming obstacles, and all of those things you can hear in the music of Carl Nielsen, especially his 6 symphonies. It works beautifully well. Mahler does it a little bit differently. Mahler, of course, throws in everything but the kitchen sink, but his music, too, ultimately points toward a destination, a place of striving and arrival, which is tonal, of course, but it doesn't follow the same rules as classical tonality. And it works. It works perfectly well. Another composer who was a master of movement is Sibelius. Sibelius has a completely personal method of moving his music along. He does it by use of what we call pedal points. Pedal points means simply a long-held note somewhere. I mean, usually in the bass. If you stand on a note, the longer you harp on a single note, the more it sounds in our ears as though that note is not exactly your home, but rather what we call the dominant, the key of fifth above where you want to go home, that you want to go elsewhere somehow. And what Sibelius does is he builds up tension by having rhythmic ostinatos above a pedal point. An ostinato is a repeated rhythm. And these rhythms are usually chugga 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 in the string parts. You can hear it marvelously in the first movement of the Fifth Symphony, its second stage principally, or in the tone poem Pochiola's Daughter, where the strings are going jump a jump a jump a jump a jump a jump like this, and underneath there is a long held note which builds up in tension as the music starts to want to move away. The tension and dissonance, that is the harmony between what's on the bottom and where the melody is going, becomes more and more dissonant until finally he'll switch pedal points at the end of the phrase or paragraph. It's like a rubber band snapping, and all of a sudden, off it goes like a rocket. It's a phenomenal technique. It really is, and you can hear it very, very vividly in most of his music, at least from the Second Symphony onwards. It's a work of genius. On Saga is a fabulous example of that. The tone poem On Saga, where you've got all these different string ostinatos, dum ba dum chugga 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 like this, and the music's going do 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 do. You hear this incredible buildup of energy, and as these shifting bass lines flip around, the music moves forward in stages each time. It's absolutely brilliant and incredibly powerful. It wasn't easy to imitate. A bunch of composers tried. I mean, William Walton's First Symphony is entirely indebted to that Sibelian technique, particularly its first movement. So there are ways to address the movement problem. The question is whether or not the composer realizes that he has one. Not all of them do. And whether some of them actually try and do something about it. Another composer who had a wonderful feeling for movement was Martinu, a contemporary composer. His feeling of movement is based on perpetual syncopation of rhythm. Instead of having just a normal tune and a normal rhythm going 1 2 3 1 2 3 1, he's da 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 ba 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 da 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 da. You never know where the accent's going to go. And because you don't know where the accent's going to go, you are constantly listening, waiting for the stability of rhythm to return. And that's another technique that creates a sense of movement. But in talking about listening critically, what I do want you to think about is, how does the composer make his music move? Does it move? There's a lot of contemporary music that isn't supposed to move. And that's fine. I mean, people like Morton Feldman or the minimalists, or, people who you may hear a lot of busyness and stuff, but the harmony is very static. And that kind of music has different rules. And it doesn't matter what those rules are, as long as the composer understands what they are and knows how to use them in a productive and musically satisfying way. But movement is a big deal. It's a tough quality to pin down, and I just wanted to throw this out there so that you could all think about it a little bit, so that you could apply it to certain pieces of music that you may like or may not like, and see if there are issues of movement. Some composers who have trouble with movement, I'll throw a couple out there. They may be great composers nonetheless, but movement isn't their specialty. Liszt always had a problem with movement, with getting his music past the finish line. However cool it was, or experimental or fabulous, however powerful the thematic transformations he might do in his symphonic poems, he always runs up against some dead spots. And sometimes he manages to get around them, and sometimes he doesn't. But Liszt often has a problem with movement. Not always. Not everybody has the same problem all the time. But there's one. Another one, Richard Strauss. Richard Strauss had a serious musical timing issue. Mostly the fact that the music seems to end about 10 minutes before it actually does. And building up movement and creating satisfying forms in his symphonic poems and even in his operas was a big problem that sometimes he mastered completely and sometimes he didn't. But he seemed to be aware of it. I think that, of all the composers, he was one of the most self-aware of all of them. And he may not have cared, or he may have just felt that his music had compensating qualities. And you may agree. It may not matter to you. That's a personal thing. We all hear things the way we hear them. So, those are just a couple examples out of many. And I think it's one of the other issues, by the way. Just say that, indicates that there's a movement problem going on is composers who don't know how to write endings. They have problems with their endings. Bartók, for example, who always had alternate endings to things. Sibelius had a problem with endings too, but his was different. His problem was that he created so much momentum, he wasn't always sure how to make it stop, how to bring it to a final standstill. Bartók's problem was simply how to find that ultimate destination that the music was going to when there aren't obvious tonal signposts that tell him where it's going. So he has to snatch the ending out of thin air and try and see how it works in terms of the overall proportions of the movement or the work. Those are all issues to think about. Things, food for thought while you listen. And I hope you enjoy listening with that in mind. It's always important to remember that composers aren't perfect human beings. Even the greatest geniuses, they all had issues now and again, issues with some aspect of musical technique. Nobody is equally good at everything. Even the geniuses like Mozart or Mendelssohn are the ones who were, born, fully formed like Athena, popping out of the head of Zeus. They all have issues. And it's not a crime to recognize what they are, because that way, and here's the key, that way we can evaluate whether the interpreters understand what those issues are and know how to get around them, to deliver a successful performance of a work by concealing its weak spots and enhancing its strong bits. It's the performer's job to understand these things, to project to us the best possible form of the music in question. Do they do it? Do they not do it? You'll tell me, or we'll discuss it together. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.